At sunrise, the sound of heavy machinery rolled across land that had never known concrete. By the time the dust settled, a clean strip of pavement cut straight through an active cattle pasture, unannounced, uninvited, and backed by an HOA that claimed it was all approved. Overnight, a working piece of land was treated like empty space, and the people behind it acted like nothing could stop them. They assumed rural life would quietly step aside for suburban plans. What they didn't realize was how dangerous it is to ignore who truly controls the land. So what happens when arrogance meets reality? Before any concrete showed up, before the paperwork threats and power plays, life on that land followed a rhythm that hadn't changed in decades. The pasture sat just outside what used to be considered the edge of town, wide and open, shaped by seasons rather than committees. Every morning began the same way, checking fences, moving cattle, walking the land to make sure nothing was out of place. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, predictable work. The kind of routine that gives you a sense of control and peace because you know exactly what depends on you. The land wasn't decorative. It wasn't vacant. It wasn't waiting for improvement. It was active, working cattle land, carefully managed to keep animals safe and productive. Fences were placed where they were for a reason. Water access, grazing rotation, and open paths all followed a logic shaped by experience, not convenience. Anyone who spent more than a few minutes there could tell it wasn't just property, it was responsibility. For years, the surrounding area reflected that understanding. A few scattered homes, dirt access roads, and neighbors who minded their own business. People waved when they passed, slowed down when livestock was nearby, and respected boundaries without needing signs to explain them. There was an unspoken agreement that land like this wasn't just scenery, it had purpose. That balance started shifting slowly, almost quietly. New housing developments crept closer, tree lines disappeared, roads widened. What had once been rural outskirts began transforming into something more polished and planned. With that change came new residents who viewed the area differently. To them, the open land wasn't a working pasture. It was unused space, a missed opportunity, something that could be repurposed. Not long after, the Homeowners Association arrived. At first, their presence barely registered. A few flyers about community guidelines, notices about landscaping standards in nearby subdivisions. None of it seemed relevant to land that had existed long before sidewalks, bike lanes, or monthly meetings. The pasture wasn't part of any development. It didn't rely on shared amenities. It answered to county regulations, not neighborhood boards. Still, the tone around the area began to change. Survey markers appeared near the fence line, subtle but noticeable. People in reflective vests walked the perimeter, taking notes and measurements without asking questions. Occasionally, unfamiliar cars would slow down along the road, passengers pointing toward the pasture as if evaluating it. There was an assumption forming, one that hadn't been spoken out loud yet, but was becoming obvious with every passing week. The land was being viewed not as private, active property, but as a blank canvas, something that could be improved for the community. The first official notice came wrapped in neutral language. References to shared access, community wellness, and enhancing connectivity. It mentioned an easement, something about long-term planning documents, and a project designed to benefit everyone. What it didn't acknowledge was the reality on the ground. Livestock, safety risks, liability, and the fact that this pasture wasn't abandoned or negotiable. From the HOA's perspective, the idea probably seemed harmless. A bike path cutting cleanly through open land. A straight line on a map connecting one neighborhood to another. From the landowner's perspective, it was the beginning of something deeply unsettling. A sign that decisions were being made by people who didn't understand the land and didn't feel the need to ask. There was no meeting request, no serious discussion. Just a growing confidence from the HOA that permission was either unnecessary or already implied. Their paperwork grew more assertive. Their language shifted from suggestion to assumption. They behaved as if the outcome was already decided and the land would simply fall in line. That's when the sense of normalcy began to crack. The pasture no longer felt quiet. Every new marker, every drive-by glance carried tension. It became clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a collision between two worlds. One shaped by land, work, and responsibility. The other by authority, planning boards, and unchecked confidence. And with both sides moving forward on very different assumptions, the conflict was no longer a matter of if, but how far it would go once action replaced paperwork. The first real sign that the situation was spiraling out of control came without warning. One morning, fresh orange spray paint appeared along the pasture fence line, cutting across grass that had been carefully managed for years. It wasn't random. It was precise. Straight lines, measurements. The kind of markings that didn't ask questions, they announced intentions. Within days, letters began arriving. Official-looking envelopes stamped with HOA letterheads that didn't technically have authority over the land, yet spoke with absolute confidence. They cited easements, community access agreements, and long-term development plans. The language was deliberately vague but carried an unmistakable tone. This was happening whether anyone agreed or not. Each notice escalated. First, it was informational. Then it became required cooperation. Then came warnings about obstruction, liability, and fines for interfering with a project deemed essential to community wellness. None of the letters acknowledged the cattle. None mentioned safety. None showed any understanding of what it meant to run active livestock across open land. Attempts to push back were met with indifference. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls were redirected. When responses did come, they were dismissive. Short explanations referencing documents that were never fully shared. The HOA behaved as though the pasture was already theirs in practice, if not on paper. Soon, the interference became physical. Survey crews began entering the land without permission. Stakes were driven into the soil. Flags appeared near watering areas and grazing routes, disrupting carefully planned movement patterns for the cattle. Every intrusion created risk. Animals grew unsettled. Gates were left unsecured. The routine that had once been predictable now felt fragile. The HOA's confidence only grew. Their representatives began showing up in person, walking the land as if inspecting an asset rather than trespassing on private property. They spoke in rehearsed phrases about shared benefit and progress, brushing off concerns with practiced smiles. Rural land, in their view, was inefficient, underutilized, something that needed to evolve. Then the fines started, not for violations within an HOA community, but for noncompliance with project timelines. Notices claimed delays were causing inconvenience. That resistance was impacting community morale. Numbers were attached. Deadlines were listed. Consequences were implied. The absurdity of it all made the situation even more infuriating. A working pasture was being treated like a neglected lot. The HOA president, emboldened by her position, began making early morning appearances. She pointed. She took photos. She referenced authority she didn't legally possess, relying on intimidation rather than legitimacy. Neighbors began to notice. Some were confused. Others were clearly entertained. A bike path through a cattle pasture was being discussed openly in HOA newsletters as if it were a done deal. Renderings circulated showing clean concrete cutting across open green space. No animals, no fences, no mention of the realities on the ground. The most unsettling moment came just before dawn one morning. The sound of engines broke the quiet. Heavy, industrial. By the time the sun crested the horizon, bulldozers sat at the edge of the pasture. Workers stood around with clipboards, waiting for a signal. And there she was, the HOA president, standing confidently with rolled-up plans under her arm. She waved papers and claimed the right to proceed. She spoke loudly, dismissively, mocking the idea that livestock operations could override community planning. To her, the land was already lost. The pasture in her mind was an obstacle that hadn't yet accepted reality. What she didn't realize was that she had just crossed the final line. As machines idled and concrete forms were unloaded, something shifted. The conflict was no longer theoretical. It wasn't about letters or markers or threats. It was happening in real time, with irreversible consequences on the line. And while the HOA believed they had prepared for everything, there was one detail they had completely overlooked, one that would turn their confidence into panic. The moment the first blade lowered toward the ground, everything changed. What the HOA saw as open space was, in reality, a tightly controlled environment governed by agricultural law, safety regulations, and liability rules they never bothered to consider. The presence of heavy machinery in an active cattle pasture wasn't just reckless, it was illegal. Authorities arrived quickly once the situation was reported. The scene became impossible to ignore, bulldozers frozen in place. Workers confused, the HOA president still clutching her papers as questions began flying from every direction. Suddenly, those documents that had seemed so powerful meant nothing. Inspectors pointed out violations, trespassing, endangerment. Unauthorized construction. The easement the HOA relied on was conditional, and those conditions had been blatantly ignored. What had been framed as a harmless bike path was now a serious legal exposure. The confidence drained from the HOA's leadership in real time. Voices softened. Explanations unraveled. What had once been arrogance turned into scrambling damage control as the reality set in. This wasn't a community improvement project anymore, it was a costly mistake. By the end of the day, the site was shut down. Orders were issued. Warnings were documented. The HOA was no longer in control of the narrative. And as the machines were hauled away, the truth became clear to everyone watching. The land had never been theirs to take, and the price for forgetting that was only just beginning. When the dust finally settled, the pasture returned to a quiet it hadn't known in weeks. The machines were gone. The flags were pulled. The orange paint faded back into grass and soil. What remained wasn't just relief, it was a shift in balance. The land felt steady again, not because the threat had vanished overnight, but because the illusion of unchecked authority had been broken. In the days that followed, the HOA went silent. No new letters arrived. No representatives showed up unannounced. The confidence that once fueled their actions had evaporated, replaced by legal caution and internal damage control. Behind closed doors, they were no longer planning bike paths. They were reviewing liability exposure, insurance risks, and the consequences of overstepping their reach. Formal notices arrived instead, this time from regulators and legal offices. The HOA was ordered to restore the pasture to its prior condition at their own expense. Soil disruption had to be corrected. Fencing had to be reinforced. Any damage caused by unauthorized access was documented and assigned a cost. What had been framed as a community improvement quietly transformed into a financial burden no one wanted to take credit for. The HOA president stopped making appearances. Rumors spread quickly through the surrounding neighborhoods. Residents who had once accepted leadership decisions without question began asking uncomfortable things. How had this been approved? Why hadn't land ownership been verified? Who signed off on entering active agricultural property without consent? The same newsletters that once promoted the bike path now avoided the topic entirely. Trust fractured, board meetings grew tense. Attendance spiked, not out of enthusiasm but concern. Homeowners wanted assurances that their association wouldn't expose them to lawsuits or fines through reckless decisions. The president's authority, once unquestioned, was openly challenged. Committees were reshuffled. Legal advisors were brought in. The HOA's tone shifted from ambitious to defensive. For the landowner, the impact went deeper than policy changes. The experience reinforced something that had always been understood but never tested this aggressively. Ownership isn't just about holding a deed, it's about defending responsibility. The pasture wasn't protected because it was loud or flashy. It was protected because it was legitimate, regulated, and grounded in reality. The land had rules long before the HOA arrived, and those rules didn't bend to confidence or convenience. Neighbors who once watched quietly began reaching out. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others admitted they had assumed the HOA knew what it was doing. A few confessed they had supported the bike path without realizing what it meant. Seeing the consequences up close changed their perspective. Open land wasn't empty land, and authority without understanding was dangerous. Over time, the incident became a reference point. Any future HOA proposal involving property boundaries, access, or shared use was met with skepticism. Easements were scrutinized. Legal language was questioned. The idea that a board could simply decide something into existence lost its power. The pasture incident lingered in the background of every discussion, an unspoken reminder of what happens when assumptions replace facts. The land itself recovered faster than expected. Grass regrew, cattle settled back into routine. The daily rhythm returned, steady and predictable. What had felt fragile during the conflict proved resilient once interference stopped. The pasture didn't need improvement, it needed respect. The broader impact extended beyond one HOA or one piece of land. It exposed a pattern that exists in many communities, the belief that authority automatically equals correctness. That paperwork replaces permission. That confidence overrides consequences. In this case, that belief collided with a reality that didn't yield. The result wasn't dramatic revenge or public spectacle, it was accountability. And accountability leaves a lasting mark. The HOA never publicly admitted fault. They didn't issue apologies or explanations. They simply moved on, quieter and more cautious than before. But silence doesn't erase memory. Everyone involved understood what had happened, even if it was never formally acknowledged. The pasture remained unchanged, not because progress was stopped, but because progress had been misunderstood. Not every open space needs a path. Not every plan improves what it touches. Some systems work because they've evolved through experience, not design meetings. The final takeaway wasn't about winning or losing. It was about boundaries, legal, practical, and ethical. About recognizing that power without understanding is fragile. That real authority doesn't announce itself with bulldozers at dawn. And that when institutions forget the limits of their reach, reality has a way of reminding them. So the next time a committee points at land and calls it opportunity, the question isn't what they want to build, but whether they've taken the time to understand what's already there.